Welcome to the Human Archive. If you enjoy original science fiction stories about humanity finding its place among the stars, subscribe and join us for the next one. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. Medical Emergency. Dr. Koroq Mehn woke to the sound reserved for neurological collapse. The alarm bypassed the gentle tones programmed for ordinary medical calls and filled his quarters with a low, pulsing vibration that Darun nervous systems found almost impossible to ignore. Koroq came upright before he consciously understood why. His bedside display was already active. Acute wake state emergency. He read the next line while pulling on his medical coat. Human employee, engineering district. Continuous wake duration, 12 hours, 7 minutes. Koroq stopped fastening the coat. 12 hours. The number pushed the last remnants of sleep from his mind. For most Federation species, 10 uninterrupted hours awake already justified medical evaluation. 12 meant the station's occupational health system assumed the workers' ability to judge their own condition could no longer be trusted. Koroq had seen why. During his residency, a cargo controller had remained awake through 2 missed restorative cycles after a docking backlog. The controller insisted he felt competent. He spoke clearly. He could answer questions. Then he misread a berth indicator and cleared a freight tug through a work zone. 3 people died. Koroq had built an entire career around never allowing that lesson to become abstract. He had rewritten scheduling policies after that accident, argued with cargo directors who wanted exceptions, and earned a reputation for treating fatigue reports more seriously than the people filing them. Nothing about his alarm at 12 hours was theoretical. He reached engineering control with 2 medical technicians and a portable neurodiagnostic unit. The emergency Koroq expected was not there. No collapsed patient lay on the floor. No confused worker staggered through the consoles. No one appeared to be restraining a delirious human. Instead, the engineering room looked insultingly ordinary. Status lights glowed across the walls. Cooling schematics moved over a large central display. Several human technicians worked at consoles, while 2 aliens monitored load reports nearby. And beside the primary systems station stood Tamsyn Wexler. Koroq recognized her from personnel records, 40 years old, Night Systems Supervisor, 11 years of orbital utilities and cryogenic infrastructure experience. Human integration clearance complete. She held a bowl of noodles in one hand. With the other, she was pointing at a cooling pump diagnostic and telling a technician that if the sensor drifted again before maintenance replaced it, she intended to remove the sensor herself and mail it to the manufacturer with a strongly worded note. Then she noticed the medical team. Her expression changed. Who's hurt? Koroq stared at her. You are. Tamsyn looked down at herself. No, I'm not. Koroq activated his wrist display and showed her the alert. You have been continuously awake for 12 hours and 9 minutes. She glanced at the number. I know. Koroq waited for the rest of the explanation. None came. Tamsyn took another bite of noodles. He said, When did you last complete restorative sleep? This afternoon. What time? A little before 4. Koroq checked the station clock. It was 2:19 in the morning. So you woke, he said carefully, and then remained awake continuously until now. Tamsyn's eyes narrowed slightly, as if she were trying to discover where the misunderstanding lived. Yes. Voluntarily, he asked. Yes, she replied. Why? The human looked around the engineering room. Several of her coworkers had begun paying attention. Tamsyn gestured toward them with the bowl. I'm on night shift. Koroq waited. The humans did not share his confusion. A maintenance technician near the rear console covered his mouth with one hand. Another looked down quickly, shoulders moving in what Koroq recognized as suppressed laughter. Koroq turned back to Tamsyn. That does not explain why you are still awake. It kind of does. You intend to remain on duty. My shift ends at 6. Koroq looked at the clock again. Her shift had nearly 4 more hours remaining. His medical training recoiled. You scheduled this. Tamsyn's confusion was becoming sympathy, which Koroq found irritating. We schedule it every night. Tamsyn had chosen nights deliberately. Her personnel notes showed years of overnight utility work, first in shipyards and later on orbital power systems. She was not enduring a strange schedule for one crisis. This was the schedule around which she had built her normal life. Koroq found that answer more alarming than the first. One of the medical technicians began preparing the cognitive scanner. Tamsyn looked at the equipment and then at Koroq. "Are you actually going to test me, because I'm awake at 2 in the morning? You have crossed the Federation emergency threshold for continuous wakefulness." "Doctor, I woke up 10 hours ago." 12. Fine, 12. She set the noodles down. "For me, that's not a medical event, that's Tuesday." The humans laughed. Koroq did not. He was beginning to suspect the station had a problem larger than one patient. Chapter 2. "You scheduled this?" Dr. Leora Pennick arrived 8 minutes later wearing a human medical jacket over clothing that looked as though it had been assembled in darkness. She walked into engineering, took in the portable diagnostic equipment, the 3 medical personnel, and Tamsyn standing beside her cooling console. Then she closed her eyes. "Oh," she said, "that." Koroq disliked the tone. "You are familiar with this issue." "I was afraid we'd missed one of the integration flags." Tamsyn folded her arms. "You think?" Leora ignored her and walked over to Koroq's display. The occupational system had already escalated the event twice because the subject remained conscious and active. Koroq pointed at the threshold. 12 hours. "Yes. You do not appear concerned." "I'm concerned about sleep deprivation. I am not concerned that Tamsyn has been awake for 12 hours after sleeping all day." Koroq stared at her. Leora brought up the human sleep profile. The database itself contained the correct numbers. Humans required substantial restorative sleep. Most adults needed several uninterrupted hours during a typical planetary day. Chronic restriction produced measurable cognitive and cardiovascular effects. None of that surprised Koroq. What surprised him was the distribution. A single major sleep interval. For most people, yes. And then continuous wakefulness. Usually. How long? Leora gave him the broad human range rather than pretending there was one precise number. Koroq listened, then looked at Tamsyn. She was eating her noodles again. "You routinely remain awake longer than 12 hours. Tamsyn swallowed. "That's not the impressive part." Koroq almost asked what could possibly be more impressive. Then he saw the shift roster. The roster included engineering, security, cargo dispatch, maintenance, medical support, logistics, and food service. A full operational structure had begun its shift at 6 in the evening, not emergency staffing. This was scheduled staffing. "You assigned an entire workforce to remain active during the night." Tamsyn looked genuinely puzzled again. "Yes," she said slowly. "Why?" he asked. "Because the station still exists at night." Several humans smiled. Koroq ignored them and turned to Leora. "This is considered medically acceptable." "With controls." That answer finally sounded like medicine. Leora asked Tamsyn how she had slept. 7.5 hours. "Any interruptions?" "Construction alarm around noon, but I went back down." "Caffeine?" "1 coffee at start of shift." "Nothing since midnight." "Any headache, visual lag, unusual irritability?" Tamsyn looked toward one of her technicians. "Do not answer that." The technician abruptly became interested in his console. Leora smiled faintly, then started the cognitive screen. Leora tested reaction time, working memory, visual tracking, and fine motor control. Tamsyn passed every measure within her recorded baseline. Koroq repeated one test. She passed again. There was no tremor, delayed recognition, balance instability, or sign of microsleep behavior. Nothing that justified calling her medically impaired. Koroq disliked being wrong less than he disliked systems being wrong. He looked at the alert again. "This threshold automatically suspends high-risk work clearance." Tamsyn stopped smiling. "Yes." Koroq checked her crew roster. 3 other humans would cross 12 continuous waking hours within the next 40 minutes. 2 held authorization for live power systems. 1 controlled cryogenic utility routing. If the automated rule functioned as written, the station would begin locking normal human workers out of their jobs before the shift ended. Leora saw the same thing. "That needs a species-specific waiver." "I can issue a temporary medical exception," Koroq said. "Permanent changes require review." Tamsyn pointed toward the clock. "We've got 3 hours and change before handoff." Koroq opened the waiver form, then noticed another entry in the shift log. One human technician had reported poor sleep before the shift. Tamsyn had reassigned him from live electrical inspection to documentation. Koroq looked at her. You removed this worker from hazardous duty voluntarily. He slept badly, but he had not crossed the 12-hour threshold. That doesn't mean he was fit for live bus work. Koroq looked from Tamsyn to Leora. The universal rule he had trusted relied almost entirely on a clock. The humans were already combining time awake with actual condition. Before he could decide whether that pleased or worried him, a deep vibration moved through the deck. Every conversation stopped. A second later, the engineering displays changed color. Tamsyn put down her noodles. The room shifted instantly from routine work to emergency response. Chapter 3. Night Shift. The collision warning reached engineering 3 seconds after the impact. The alert identified dock spine 3, an inbound cargo tug, and a magnetic coupler failure during final approach. The tug crew had executed emergency braking and avoided the occupied construction berth, but the vessel's stern had clipped an exterior service structure before controls stabilized. Tamsyn read the first report while the station was still shuddering. Utility spine took the hit. A human technician pulled up external telemetry. Cryogenic pressure falling on primary return. Another voice came from cargo control. Dock restraints are holding, but we lost 2 alignment sensors. Koroq remained near the medical console. He had spent enough time around industrial emergencies to know when he was useful and when he was in the way. For the first seconds he was in the way, Tamsyn's crew moved around him with sudden economy. The casual night room vanished. No one raised their voice. No one panicked. A technician who had been cutting birthday cake 3 minutes earlier was now isolating non-essential thermal load from dock spine 3. The human who had joked about Tamsyn's irritability began confirming personnel locations in the affected service gallery. Someone pushed the noodle bowl away from the controls before it could spill. Koroq noticed that because his mind needed something small to hold, while the engineering displays became worse. Cryogenic coolant pressure continued dropping. Naker Point's power trunks relied on superconducting lines kept below a narrow thermal threshold. If too much of the system warmed, electrical resistance would rise sharply. A local failure could become a station-wide quench. It would not begin with an explosion. The failure would be slower and more methodical. A cascading quench could trip power districts offline, destabilize dock restraints, force fuel handling into emergency shutdown, and make environmental systems consume backup capacity faster than it could be replaced. Tamsyn reached for primary isolation. Her console chimed. The command failed. She tried again. A red medical banner covered the control interface. Operator high-risk authorization suspended. Below it. Wake state limit exceeded. For half a second, Tamsyn simply stared. Koroq's stomach tightened. Another minute had passed. Her temporary waiver had not yet propagated to central industrial control. Tamsyn's deputy moved to the adjacent console. His hand touched the panel. Another red banner appeared. He had crossed the threshold too. 2 of the people most qualified to isolate the damaged coolant loop had just been locked out by Koroq's own safety system. The engineering model projected the first superconducting instability in under 2 minutes. Tamsyn turned toward him. She did not plead. "Doctor, I need access." Koroq looked at the medical banner. 26 years of instinct told him not to disable fatigue protection under pressure. That was exactly when people made bad decisions. He looked at Tamsyn. Tamsyn had a normal cognitive screen, a normal motor test, documented sleep, and no impairment indicators. The rule was functioning exactly as designed for the species it had been built around. For Tamsyn, the calibration was wrong. Koroq opened the Emergency Medical Authority panel. The system requested confirmation. He gave it, then requested confirmation again because the override involved live superconducting infrastructure. He gave that too. Tamsyn's console cleared. She did not thank him. She went straight back to work. Closing primary feed. Shift dock 3 and 4 load to secondary trunk. Keep habitat circuits where they are. The damaged loop was isolated. Coolant loss slowed. Temperature continued climbing, but the immediate catastrophic rise had stopped. The first quench projection disappeared. Koroq let out a breath, then realized what he had done. He had personally overridden a Federation fatigue safeguard during an active station emergency. The action was logged under his name. There would be review. The decision could trigger disciplinary review. He looked at the engineering room. No one cared. They were busy keeping Naker Point alive. Tamsyn glanced at him only once. Good call. Koroq did not feel good about it. He felt responsible for what happened next. From that point on, he would have to judge the evidence instead of hiding behind the threshold. Chapter 4. The Night Crew. The first full damage assessment arrived 12 minutes later. The cargo tug had struck harder than external imaging suggested. The primary coolant manifold was partially ruptured. One secondary return line had split near the impact zone. Several automatic sensors remained online, but had drifted far enough from manual gauges that engineering no longer trusted them. Tamsyn pulled the system into a semi-manual operating mode. Koroq watched her crew divide the work. One team managed power redistribution. Another tracked thermal rise along the superconducting trunks. A maintenance crew prepared to enter the service gallery once structural control cleared it. A third group monitored dock restraint power so the station would not solve one crisis by creating another. Koroq checked the specialist roster. Where is cryogenic systems lead? Rest cycled, Tamsyn said. Wake him. She looked at the display. Which one? Koroq had expected immediate agreement. You have 3 senior cryogenic specialists listed off duty. One's Darun. One's Salathi, one's Gar. Yes. They're all asleep. I am aware. Tamsyn frowned. You don't want to wake all 3. Koroq stared at her. No. Good. The answer surprised him. Tamsyn tapped the damage report. Wake the Salathi. She knows the exterior manifold retrofit. Leave the others unless we need them. Koroq looked at her more carefully. You agreed. Why wouldn't I? You are operating during a biological period in which many other species sleep. That doesn't mean I want them dragged out of bed for work somebody else can do. Koroq had assumed, without admitting it to himself, that a species comfortable with long waking intervals might treat shorter restorative requirements as inconvenience. Tamsyn did not. She treated them as constraints. They were different biological constraints, not lesser ones. The Salathi specialist was awakened. The others remained asleep. Meanwhile, the human crew handled everything that did not require species-specific expertise. Koroq began seeing the shape of the night shift more clearly. It was not one unusually wakeful engineer. The humans had populated the dark hours. There were enough of them to maintain normal systems, run emergency response, move cargo, staff security checkpoints, and feed the people doing all of those things. Naker Point had always operated continuously, but most Federation staffing cycles overlapped in shorter blocks. There was no single night workforce because Darun, Salathi, Gar, Orvethi, and dozens of others slept at different intervals. Humans had arrived and imposed a familiar human structure on themselves. Humans divided their own staffing into day crew and night crew with 12-hour operational blocks and handoffs at the edges. Koroq had considered it culturally quaint. At 3:20 in the morning, with much of the senior alien utility staff inside medically necessary restorative sleep, it stopped looking quaint. The human night crew was not merely emergency backup. They were the station's scheduled overnight workforce. Chapter 5. 5 hours of heat. The thermal model gave them 5 hours before the undamaged trunk exceeded safe margin. That number was an estimate, and Tamsyn treated it like one. 5 hours if load stays where it is, she told the room. Less if Dock 2 brings that fabrication array back online, so call them and make sure they understand that nothing wakes up without our approval. Koroq watched her assign the work. 2 humans and the awakened Salathi specialist would supervise the damaged coolant isolation from central control. A maintenance team would patch the ruptured return line. Power operations would redistribute non-essential industrial loads. Another crew would manually balance coolant pressure around the damaged manifold. Koroq found his attention returning to Tamsyn's medical timer. Tamsyn had now been awake for 13 hours. Leora noticed. She's fine. For now. Correct. Koroq looked at her. You agree the risk is increasing? Of course. Then why allow continued duty? Because risk isn't binary. Leora checked Tamsyn's pupils, reaction latency, and speech pattern while the engineer continued working. Tamsyn tolerated it with the expression of someone accustomed to being inconvenienced by professionals. Leora lowered the scanner. No meaningful change from baseline. Koroq pointed toward the clock. She has been continuously awake more than 13 hours. And she slept properly before shift. That does not make the time irrelevant. I didn't say it did. Leora's tone sharpened slightly. 12 hours awake isn't the problem. Pretending there is no number that becomes a problem would be. Tamsyn, still listening while reviewing coolant data, raised one hand. I'd also like that on the record. Leora ignored her. Koroq looked around the engineering room. The humans had brightened the work lighting earlier in the shift. Now, closer to morning, the light level had begun reducing slightly in break areas while critical consoles remained bright. Meal breaks were staggered. One technician drank water before reaching for coffee and was mocked gently by a coworker for demonstrating suspicious maturity. Another reported a headache and traded a monitoring task with someone else. This was not a species pretending fatigue did not exist. They had simply placed the threshold somewhere else. The maintenance crew reached the damaged return line. Their helmet feed showed a split in the pipe housing and frost spreading across the surrounding structure. Tamsyn leaned toward the console. Patch is going to take longer. The maintenance lead agreed. Mount is warped. We have to cut the outer brace first. The 5-hour thermal margin became less comfortable. Koroq looked again at the human night crew. They had been awake longer than most species on the station could safely manage. None of them looked heroic. They looked like people doing their jobs. Chapter 6. The first save makes it worse. At 4:12, coolant pressure stabilized. The engineering room relaxed for approximately 40 seconds. Then a new warning appeared. The secondary superconducting trunk was warming. Tamsyn's deputy swore under his breath. The isolation that had saved the damaged loop had forced too much electrical load onto the undamaged side. Koroq watched the thermal curve climb. Can you reduce load? Yes, Tamsyn said. Question is what we're willing to turn off. The first option was immediate industrial shedding. Immediate load shedding would cut fabrication docks, cargo climate systems, non-critical habitation zones, and parts of the shipyard stabilization network. Tamsyn studied the consequences. Several half-assembled vessels relied on powered restraint while structural work remained incomplete. They would not break free immediately, but dropping support would force evacuation and complicate repair. The second option used an older cooling circuit installed before Naker Point's last expansion. It was not rated for full station load. It did not need to be. They only needed enough additional heat rejection to keep the trunk cold while repairs continued. The old construction loop still has 2 independent pumps, Tamsyn said. Her deputy nodded. And a return path that hasn't been certified for this load in 7 years. Which is why we don't give it full load. The Salathi specialist examined the numbers. It may work. May. Tamsyn glanced at her. The specialist answered without embarrassment. The construction loop was modified after my last assignment to this station. I cannot certify the internal branch geometry from memory. A human maintenance technician brought up archived drawings. Another found the last inspection notes. A third cursed softly. One valve has been sticking. Tamsyn looked over. Which one? Bypass return. Maintenance logged it 3 weeks ago. Still inside tolerance. Replacement scheduled next cycle. That detail entered the plan. Tamsyn treated the sticky valve as a known risk rather than a surprise. Tamsyn made the decision. We build the cross-connection. Keep dock stabilizers powered. If that valve starts drifting, I want manual confirmation before anyone trusts the sensor. The choice narrowed their remaining options. Once maintenance began opening the old cooling route, returning to the previous configuration would take time they might not have. Koroq understood enough engineering to know that. What does the field work require? Tamsyn pulled up the service gallery. People in the damaged spine. The casual night shift was gone entirely now. The workers who had begun the evening complaining about meetings and cafeteria food were preparing for hazardous entry beside a damaged cryogenic line. Koroq thought about the first alert. 12 hours awake. Medical emergency. The earlier misunderstanding no longer felt funny. If the humans did not manage their longer waking interval correctly, Naker Point might still prove the Federation threshold right for the wrong reason. Chapter 7. Awake does not mean fit. The first volunteer for the service gallery was a human systems technician named Rainer Holt. Koroq saw the name on the assignment board and checked his medical status automatically. Raynor had been awake for 16 hours and 51 minutes. Koroq crossed the room. Tamsyn. She followed his gaze. Her expression changed immediately. Raynor, hold up. The technician was already sealing his work harness. I'm good. Tamsyn did not argue. Run fault sequence 9 for me. Raynor frowned. Now. She pushed a diagnostic panel toward him. The sequence was simple enough that even Koroq recognized the structure. The check required him to confirm isolation and redundant pressure, verify the mechanical lock, disable the remote override, and confirm the environmental monitor. Raynor moved through it quickly, then stopped. Tamsyn said nothing. Raynor stared at the panel. He had skipped the mechanical lock confirmation. The realization reached his face. Oh. Yeah. He looked angry with himself. I can still go. No. We need people. We need people who aren't one missed, step away from opening the wrong side of a cryogenic line. Raynor opened his mouth. Tamsyn softened her voice. Go home, sleep. If this mess is still here when you wake up, I promise we'll save you some. That drew a weak laugh from the room. Raynor surrendered the harness. Raynor was not humiliated. No one turned the decision into a speech about toughness. Raynor left engineering. Leora updated his record and ordered mandatory rest. Koroq watched him go. Raynor's misstep mattered more to Koroq than Tamsyn's earlier cognitive test. Humans did not have a magical number. The night shift's strength was not that every worker could remain capable for 16 hours. Raynor had slept poorly before duty. His wake duration was longer. His performance had started to slip. The humans found it, then removed him despite needing hands. Koroq looked at the universal medical logic again. Continuous wake duration remained useful. It simply could not carry the entire decision. He returned to Leora. Show me your fatigue model. She did. The model considered sleep obtained before duty, time awake, circadian timing, reaction performance, self-report, peer observation, recent workload, and task criticality. The model was more complicated than a single cutoff. The model was harder to automate than a single cutoff. It was also better matched to human fatigue. Koroq opened his medical authority console. What are you doing? Leora asked. Correcting the metric. Chapter 8. The wrong metric. The station system resisted the change. The resistance was not malicious. It was bureaucratic. The fatigue control software had been designed around Federation medical law, which required automatic restrictions once a worker crossed species-neutral danger thresholds. Humans had been added to Naker Point quickly. Their personnel files existed. Their health ranges existed. But the control layer still treated 12 continuous waking hours as a universal barrier. Koroq could not rewrite Federation law in the middle of an emergency. He could issue a station-level medical exception. So he did. For humans, 12 hours became advisory rather than disqualifying. At 14, automated monitoring frequency increased. At higher values, task authorization required medical or supervisory confirmation based on performance indicators and prior sleep. Any demonstrated impairment overrode the waiver regardless of time awake. The system asked Koroq to accept professional liability. He did, then he sent the rule to Leora. Review it. She read in silence. Tamsyn looked over from the engineering console. You too finished redesigning medicine. No, Koroq said. Only the part interfering with your access. Appreciated. Koroq watched the new rule propagate. One by one, the red medical warnings on human consoles changed to amber informational notices. The medical system stopped automatically removing qualified human operators from the emergency. Koroq expected satisfaction. Instead, he felt more responsible than before. A rigid rule could be blamed. Judgment could not. If a human made a fatigue-related mistake now, some portion of that failure belonged to him. He understood why medicine liked numbers. Numbers made medical rules easier to enforce, but they could also hide biological differences. Tamsyn's crew did not appear interested in philosophical complications. They were busy opening the old construction cooling loop. The first construction loop pump started. Then the second pump came online. Temperature rise slowed. A maintenance team entered the service gallery. The patch operation began. For nearly an hour, the system held. Koroq began to believe they might make it to morning. Then Tamsyn rubbed both eyes with the heels of her hands. The motion lasted only a second. Koroq noticed. So did Leora. Now Koroq could see human fatigue beginning to matter in real time. Chapter 9. The Longest Hour. By 5:15, Tamsyn had been awake a little over 15 hours. She was still functioning. That was not the same as functioning identically. Koroq had spent too many years measuring impairment to miss the small changes. She asked for one report to be repeated because she had been reading another display at the same time. She drank water and forgot where she set the cup. Her humor flattened. The changes were subtle but increasingly visible to Koroq. Nothing that would justify calling her medically unfit. But the person Koroq met at 2:19 was not exactly the person standing at the console now. Leora ran another quick check. Tamsyn passed, barely slower than baseline, still acceptable. Then the old bypass valve changed position. The sensor reported full travel, pressure did not. Tamsyn looked at the mismatch. Sensor drift. Her deputy shook his head. Could be the valve. Position indicator says open. Pressure says it is. Tamsyn frowned. For 3 seconds, Koroq watched fatigue interact with experience. Tamsyn had spent the entire night distrusting bad sensors. Her first interpretation was reasonable. This time it was wrong. Her deputy pulled up the maintenance note from 3 weeks earlier. The old maintenance note identified a sticky bypass return valve. Tamsyn closed her eyes once. Right, manual check. Tamsyn showed no defensiveness. She did not try to preserve authority for its own sake. The field crew confirmed that the valve had only traveled partway. The valve had jammed halfway open. Tamsyn changed the cooling plan. The deputy handled the next adjustment. Koroq watched her step back voluntarily. Her willingness to yield the adjustment impressed him more than catching the problem would have. A supervisor could demand obedience. A competent one had to know when someone else's judgment had become more reliable. At 5:40, the temporary cooling path was nearly ready. The damaged return line was partially patched. Thermal margin remained narrow but stable. The morning relief crew would arrive at 6. Tamsyn had spent years insisting that night crews document for people who had not lived through the same hours. Every temporary state, half-finished repair, and ugly workaround needed to survive the person who created it. Koroq expected Tamsyn to remain through final restoration. So did part of her. He could see it. She had been inside every decision since the impact. She knew which sensor lied, which valve stuck, which repair brace had warped, which maintenance crew was still inside the gallery. Leaving now meant handing a live, incomplete emergency to someone who had not watched it develop. Leora came to stand beside her. Your relief is in 20 minutes. I know. Plan to use them. Tamsyn looked at the system board. If the patch slips during handoff, then a rested supervisor handles it. Tamsyn did not answer immediately. Koroq understood the dilemma. The night shift had been valuable because it provided continuous coverage without requiring any one person to remain indefinitely. If Tamsyn treated that advantage as permission to remain indefinitely, she would turn strength into liability. At 5:58, the morning crew entered engineering. Chapter 10. Handoff. Koroq had expected chaos. Fresh workers walked into a control room that had spent nearly 3 hours reacting to a damaged cryogenic network. They had not heard the arguments. They had not watched the first isolation fail. They had not seen the old construction loop come online. They did not know which alarms were real and which were sensor artifacts. Koroq thought he had found the weakness in the human shift model. Then Tamsyn began the handoff. The incoming supervisor was a human woman named Harper Das. She did not ask Tamsyn to tell the entire story. The written logs had already preserved most of the history. Every configuration change carried a timestamp. Temporary valve positions were tagged. The unreliable sensor was marked both electronically and physically. The maintenance crew inside the service gallery appeared on a live personnel board. The old construction loop had a warning attached to its return path. Tamsyn gave Harper the pieces that could not be understood from status alone. Secondary trunk is carrying more load than I'd like, but it's stable as long as fabrication stays down. Do not reopen primary isolation until field crew clears the cracked manifold. Bypass valve is physically half open even though the position sensor says full. We're controlling around it manually. Harper repeated the critical points back to her. Tamsyn continued. Dock restraints are stable. We woke one Salathi cryo specialist because she knows the retrofit. Darun and Gar specialists are still in normal rest cycle. Patch team expects another 40 minutes, but outer brace deformation may push that. Harper checked the notes. Heat rejection margin 12% and rising slowly if the old loop behaves. Sensor confidence. Manual pressure good. Temperature array on the damaged side is garbage. Trust the independent probes. Harper nodded, then asked the question Koroq had been waiting for. What are you least sure about? Tamsyn looked at the board. The return distribution once they bring the patch up to pressure. We modeled it, but we haven't tested the actual geometry since the last dock expansion. Harper recorded that. Harper recorded the uncertainty without embarrassment. Neither supervisor tried to hide what they did not know. The handoff lasted 9 minutes. At the end, Harper placed her palm against the control authorization pad. Tamsyn did the same. The station transferred supervisory authority. No alarms sounded. There was no dramatic pause. A name changed at the top of the engineering console. Only the supervisor name at the top of the console changed. Koroq realized he had been waiting for a ceremony. For the humans, continuity was a procedure. Tamsyn stepped away from the console. Koroq stared. You are leaving. She looked at him. Yes. The repair is unfinished. My replacement is rested. You possess more direct knowledge of the failure. She has the logs, the tags, the crew notes, and me standing here for questions during handoff. Koroq glanced at the system board. You could remain awake longer. Tamsyn gave him a tired smile. That doesn't mean I should. Liara pointed toward the door. Home. Tamsyn started walking. Then Koroq called after her. If you leave because you are tired while the station remains at risk. She stopped, not offended, just tired enough to answer plainly. If I stay because I don't trust my own handoff, that's a different problem. Koroq had no response. Tamsyn left. The engineering room did not become less competent when she did. Watching Tamsyn leave while the room kept functioning finally changed Koroq's understanding of the night shift. Chapter 11. The station keeps working. Harper changed 2 decisions within 20 minutes. Koroq noticed because he had expected the morning crew to preserve Tamsyn's plan exactly. The morning crew did not preserve Tamsyn's plan exactly. They preserved the state of the problem and changed the solution when new evidence demanded it. Koroq understood the distinction. A pressure imbalance developed when the field team began bringing the patched return line back towards service. Harper slowed the restart. The Salathi specialist recommended a narrower pressure ramp. Harper accepted it. Then at 6:40, a Darun cryogenic engineer woke naturally from his scheduled restorative cycle and reported for duty. Koroq knew him by reputation. He was a senior specialist, excellent with thermal oscillation modeling and irritatingly precise. He reviewed the temporary cross-connection, then found something the human night crew had not. The old construction loop could tolerate a different pressure profile if the station deliberately shifted heat rejection toward the outer fabrication radiators for 12 minutes. Harper checked the risk. The Salathi specialist checked the manifold limits. The human power team verified electrical margin. They implemented it together. Temperature began falling slowly. It did not fall quickly, but it fell enough to restore thermal margin. The service gallery crew completed the patch. The repaired return line took pressure. The jammed bypass valve remained half open, so the morning crew worked around it until maintenance could replace it safely. Dock restraints stayed powered. No fabrication vessel drifted free. Fuel handling never lost emergency cooling. Primary life support remained online across the station. By 7:20, the threat of cascading quench was gone. Koroq stood in engineering while the control room settled from crisis into repair. Harper's crew was fresh. The Salathi specialist had been awake only long enough to contribute what she knew. The Darun engineer had entered after restorative sleep and solved the pressure profile nobody else had recognized. The night crew had covered the hours when those experts were sleeping. Then they had handed the system over before fatigue turned endurance into error. Naker Point survived because no single person had to remain awake forever. Koroq looked at the empty place where Tamsyn had stood. The empty console where Tamsyn had stood made his original assumption look incomplete. He had spent his career protecting systems from exhausted individuals. The human system expected the individual to leave before fatigue made that person the weak point. Chapter 12. How long were you awake? Tamsyn returned that evening. Koroq was still on station because his own sleep schedule had been disrupted by the emergency. He had completed 1 restorative interval, reviewed the medical logs, and returned to engineering to observe the repaired system. Tamsyn walked in at 5:42 carrying coffee. She looked different, sharper. Her face had lost the dull heaviness Koroq had noticed near handoff. She read a diagnostic panel once and absorbed it instead of reading twice. Her humor returned before she reached the central console. Still here. Koroq looked at her. You are asking me that? Fair. He checked her sleep record. Tamsyn had slept for 8 hours and 11 minutes. Your recovery was adequate. I'm touched. Koroq ignored that. How long had you been awake when you transferred control? Tamsyn thought about it. Just under 16 hours. Koroq stared. For a Darun, 16 continuous hours would likely require medical intervention. Which is why you shouldn't put a Darun on my schedule. The answer was so obvious that Koroq almost found it insulting. Tamsyn examined the repaired system. The morning crew had left notes. She read them, smiled once at the pressure solution. Nice catch. You are not disturbed that they changed your plan. Why would I be? It was your emergency. It was the station's emergency. Koroq remembered the distinction. Koroq had seen workers make fatigue dangerous because pride refused to hand over control. He had seen physicians remain on duty because no replacement seemed sufficiently informed. He had seen commanders turn endurance into a personal contest. Tamsyn did none of that. The night shift had worked partly because she trusted the handoff enough to leave. Koroq asked, do humans consider what happened unusual? The impact, yes. The shift? No. She looked toward him. Don't make it heroic, doctor. I worked my shift. It got ugly. I handed it off. Then I went home and slept. That sequence protected the station. So did the day crew. Yes. And the Salathi specialist. Yes. And your Darun cryo-engineer. Yes. Tamsyn took a drink of coffee. Sounds like a station. Koroq found he had nothing useful to add. Chapter 13. Species-specific. The formal review took 9 days. Koroq expected resistance. Instead, he got paperwork. Koroq understood the distinction. Naker Point's medical authority approved species-specific wake state thresholds for human personnel. 12 continuous waking hours no longer triggered automatic removal from high-risk work. Instead, the station used human occupational fatigue criteria developed with Leora's program. Time awake still mattered, as did sleep before duty, circadian timing, performance, and task risk. Automatic alerts remained. Automatic disqualification did not. Koroq extended the review beyond humans. Every universal fatigue threshold used on Naker Point now required biological provenance, which species had produced the data, which nervous systems had actually been studied, which limits were genuinely universal, and which had merely become universal because they were old. The revision did not weaken Federation's safety doctrine. It made the doctrine more biologically precise. Human night crews also received formal recognition as primary overnight staffing instead of auxiliary coverage. That change pleased Tamsyn far more than the medical revision. It means administration can stop scheduling mandatory integration meetings at 11 in the morning. Koroq looked at her. You object to 11 in the morning. I'm asleep. That is the middle of the day. Not mind. Koroq made a note. Tamsyn stared. You are not putting that in policy. I am considering it. Doctor. He enjoyed her discomfort more than was professionally necessary. Chapter 14. Someone is awake. Months passed. The damaged manifold was replaced. The jammed bypass valve finally went to recycling, where Tamsyn reportedly wished it a difficult afterlife. The cargo tug returned to service. Naker Point kept operating, night after night. Koroq stopped noticing the human shift changes at first. Then he began noticing them differently. At 6 in the evening, humans arrived saying good morning. At 3 in the morning, the cafeteria served a meal no one could agree was dinner. By 5:30, the lighting and engineering softened slightly while critical work areas stayed bright. And at 6, names changed at the top of control consoles as problems transferred and people went home. Koroq no longer interpreted this as biological stubbornness. It was a form of infrastructure, not metal or machinery. It was human procedure. One set of hands passing a problem to another before the first set became unreliable. The galaxy had many species that recovered from sleep faster than humans. Many could function efficiently on shorter cycles. Some could enter restorative states almost anywhere. Humans could not. They needed substantial sleep, protected sleep, and enough of it to return capable. So they planned around the fact that every worker would eventually need sleep. They scheduled replacements. They wrote things down. They built routines that assumed a worker would eventually become tired and need to leave. Koroq understood why the night crew had confused him. He had mistaken waking endurance for the central achievement. It was only one biological condition that made the schedule possible. The larger achievement was the system built around predictable human limits. He wrote none of that into the policy review. The policy was already finished. The station did not need that reflection in its policy manual. It needed correct thresholds, reliable monitoring, and good handoffs. Epilogue. Informational only. 3 months after the coolant emergency, Koroq was awake at 2 in the morning because his own Darun sleep cycle had placed him between restorative intervals. His medical terminal chimed. The old tone struck his nervous system before he could stop it. He looked down. Human worker, 12 hours continuous wakefulness. His body tightened automatically. Then he read the next line, informational only, no impairment indicators. Koroq stood still for a moment. He was already near engineering. Against his better judgment, he looked inside. Tamsyn was there. Of course, Tamsyn was there. She was reviewing routine maintenance notes with the final hour of her shift approaching. A newly assigned alien technician stood near the door staring at the same notification on his own console. "Doctor," the technician said, alarm entering his voice, "this human has exceeded 12 hours awake." Koroq raised one hand. "Do not call emergency medicine." The technician looked confused. Before Koroq could explain, Tamsyn glanced over from the console. "You're learning." Koroq checked her shift timer. "Your relief arrives in 43 minutes. Tamsyn sighed, "Unfortunately." Koroq left the humans to their night.